A couple of requests up front. Got a little Twitter video here which you might care to share, the link to which is in the description below. As I was making this video about the Prime Ministerial lockdown bombshell, I started looking again at where we have the notorious deadly Neil Ferguson, remember him, bang to rights. And I ended up putting together this little gem here, which you will see better explained further into the video, and we do genuinely have him on the end of a hook here. If I had to choose between one or the other, I would probably request a share on the part of the second one. For one thing, because Carol Sikora has already highlighted the clip and written about it, and it's been shared pretty widely on that basis, but primarily because Ferguson is bang to rights on that potentially catastrophic blunder. It wasn't catastrophic in the event, but it could have been, and identical such efforts on his part in early 2020 almost certainly were catastrophic, and nobody ever has really talked about this one, where we do have him bang to rights. So if you are up to just one share today, then this one would be extremely useful, and the link to it is in fact the first link in the description. The Prime Minister dropped a now well-aired bombshell, which I'm happy to air further, in the whitewash, which is the COVID inquiry. This is during the last 20 minutes of the session, whose link is now the third link in the description box underneath this video. The interrogator is on a mission to extract a confession.
Do you recall in June how an HMT official who attended SAGE provided a readout which referred to the fact that the CMO, Professor Sir Chris Whitty, and the government's chief scientific advisor, Professor Sir Patrick Vallance, began to warn that the package of measures for reopening, in particular the beginning of July, was at the riskier end of the spectrum and therefore had the potential to increase R above 1. Do you recall that warning being relayed to you, or to the Treasury, at the end of June?
That question is repeated multiple times before the end of the session. The chief advisors were advising to not loosen up. Do you remember that? In other words, the real question he's asking is, did Boris Johnson ignore them? So by way of prelude, and after that question is repeated another 2 times, Sunak tells us that the data was dodgy.
And I think the other thing, as I said, that was relevant consideration at this time was that in June, probably actually 3 days before this email, the SAGE minutes record that there had been errors that meant that for some time they had been overestimating the rate of transmission, making it look artificially high.
The devil's spawn of Whitty and Vallance had been looking at an exaggerated COVID transmission number, and that had the effect of making their overall predictions artificially high, which is in itself a bit of a revelation in the context of this whitewash. Then we get more repetitions of, were you aware that the advisors were recommending harder and longer, yada yada yada. Sunak rejects that. He reminds us about the dodgy data, then he delivers his bombshell.
That's just not my recollection of it. I think there were genuine issues about the robustness of the data, but also where the R was coming from. But also, I think analysis has been done subsequent to this that I wasn't aware of at the time, from I think professors of medicine and economics at Imperial and Manchester, that applied a Quayle analysis to the first lockdown and its duration, and their Quayle analysis, which you'll be familiar with as a tool of health, public health analysis, suggested that the lockdown in its severity and duration is likely to have generated costs that are greater than the likely benefit.
Maybe listen to the relevant bit again.
Analysis has been done subsequent to this that I wasn't aware of at the time, from I think professors of medicine and economics at Imperial and Manchester, that applied a Quayle analysis to the first lockdown and its duration, and their Quayle analysis suggested that the lockdown in its severity and duration is likely to have generated costs that are greater than the likely benefit.
The sum total of the costs with the supposed benefits added on was negative, i.e. more harm than good, potentially. That coming from the then second in command and one of the chief decision makers at the time. in defence of this constant question, why did you ever release the lockdown measures at all, he quotes evidence concluding that
the lockdown in its severity and duration is likely to have generated costs that are greater than the likely benefit.
And the interrogator immediately cuts him off.
Well,
so I think I wasn't aware of that at the time.
I'm so
but
sorry.
I think
I don't want to get into quality life assurance models.
And he cuts him off with a good reason, because if what Sunak says is correct, then the whole thing is blown out the water. You might think, well, the lockdown saved 1 million lives, but if they then cost 1,000,001, they were a mistake. The idea that they would have saved so many lives is probably a bit dubious. The second COVID peak over winter 2021 saw deaths peaking on the 29th of December and falling for fully 8 days before the January lockdown was ever started. Whatever else you might want to claim, it can't be that the lockdown caused the fall, because when the deaths started falling, the lockdown hadn't even started. Then, crucially, 11 months later, as I alluded to above, in December, the usual suspects were making apocalyptic predictions about what would happen in the event of no more lockdowns, claiming that a minimum of 3,000 deaths, 45 per million per day, with interventions would happen. Minimum 3,000, maximum 6,000 without interventions per day. And in the actual event, during that tiny little peak in winter 21-22, deaths hit just over 200 per day. Prediction without interventions between 3,000 and 6,000, and this was all reported in the press at the time. Experts slammed the fictitious projections of 6,000 daily deaths. Reality without interventions 200. Predictions 3,000 to 6,000, reality 200. And that prediction, an exaggeration by a factor of between 15 and 30, came from our old friend Neil Ferguson. It's impossible to say what would have happened without the spring and winter lockdowns in 2020, because they happened. But you can say that those same people made those same predictions about the same virus just the following year, and we can now check their work, because the coveted lockdowns didn't happen. And it turned out that they had exaggerated to the tune of between 15 and 30 times, which makes those March 2020 predictions look ludicrous. And the bigger question is, why has nobody ever really spoken about this? Ludicrous Neil Ferguson predictions for winter 21-22, 45 per million per day, 70 and 95. 3,000, 4,500 and 6,000 daily deaths. Reality, 3 per million per day on the worst day. The rest were much lower. So when the Prime Minister says
the lockdown in its severity and duration is likely to have generated costs that are greater than the likely benefit,
very glad to hear it. But even then, costs outweigh the benefits. Even then, he may be considering benefits which were vastly exaggerated. Don't forget to share either the Sunak video clip or maybe preferably my beautifully succinct little juxtaposition of the wretched Ferguson's idiotically fake predictions next to the provable actual reality that happened. Maybe eventually, now that the Prime Minister is nudging open the lockdowns might have been a disaster door, people can be persuaded to look better at where the predictions they were based on were provable, demonstrable nonsense.